Welcome to the video. In this one, we are going to create a sample analog gauge using the new gauge tool in version 2022.2 of the Z1 Designer for use in the Z1 dashboard. We're going to create an RPM gauge and then put in a secondary needle into that for the maximum RPM reached. And then we're going to overlay a transparent gauge for fuel level within the RPM gauge. There'll be timestamps in the video below, so if you want to skip around to see a specific part, please do so, or watch the whole video from start to finish. So with that, let's get started. So this is the gauge tool. If you don't see it, you can just scroll down or expand your toolbar. So we're going to select that, and we're going to drag out a gauge. And we're going to hold the Shift key down because I want to make it symmetrical. I want it to be the same horizontal and vertical radius, and yeah, I want it in the background. So one thing to talk about with gauges is that they actually create two objects. There's the gauge and there's the needle. So the needle needs to be in the foreground because it has to move, where the gauge, nothing changes on it, so it should stay in the background unless there's a really good reason not to. Perhaps if you were using a conditional color on it or something like that. But assuming you're not, it should go in the background. So now we've got our gauge drawn here, and I'm going to, for this explanation, just use it as RPM. So I'm going to leave that, and I'm going to leave the current dimensions where they are. So I'm going to change the color. We'll go a red, and I'm going to put it as, actually raised was fine, but I'm going to make this slightly bigger, and I'm going to give it some grooves on the inside. And I want the shadow, so I'll leave this checked. The next thing is the start and the end angles. Again, for this, I'm going to leave them as they are. You can move them if you want. But I'm going to change this to a $10,000 value as the end value. So that my gauge goes from 0 to 10,000. I also need to change my zone up to 10,000. And then finally, the tick marks here, they also need to be 10,000 because they're all going to end at the same place. And the same for I want minor ticks, I'm going to keep them at 10,000. All right, so now the next thing I want to do is choose the needle and make sure that is how I want it. In this case it's fine, the basic. I do want a shadow. Turn it back on. And where it is in the length, make it a little bit longer. So that's fine. And then for my tick marks, most of this is fine. I'm going to change the upper range. We'll take this to say 8,500, and the same for here, 8,500. And I'm going to make these curved. And perhaps a bit more frequent. So instead of every 200, every 100. Looks a little bit better, I think. All right, so now the next thing is, can I use this to have two needles on one gauge? So the reason I would do that is if I want to have an RPM that has the telltale to show what the maximum RPM has been at a certain time. So to do that, I'm basically going to copy this gauge and paste another one. So I have the exact same thing. So I'm going to use the arrow keys to make sure they're in the same location. All right, so now I have two gauges which are identical, and they're basically right now one on top of the other. So what I'm going to do for one of them is change it from the RPM to the maximum RPM reached. No, that's not what I wanted. Maximum RPM reached. Now, I also don't want to have like this weird duplicate gauge thing going on. So for this one, I'm going to say I don't want a ring style, and I don't want a ring color, and I don't want a background color. And then I also don't want a shadow. I'm going to leave the zones and everything as they are because I need the two dials to be the same. I'm going to change the needle, so we'll get something else. Perhaps that is going to be our telltale needle. And then I also do not want tick marks at all. And the last thing is I actually want the telltale to be underneath the other needle. So here in the foreground, this needle should be on top of the telltale. So now I have one gauge with two needles on it, showing the RPM and then the maximum RPM reached. Then the final thing we're going to do is put in a small field gauge down here and then some text. So the text is easy. I just do my text tool. Where do I want it? I want it right here, let's say. It needs to be in the background, and I want it to be black text so I can see it. And it's just going to say RPM. And so this is where that's going to be, and that is looking. That's looking good for my RPM gauge. So now if I want to have a small fuel gauge down here, I drag out another gauge and I'll put it in right here for the moment. It's probably fine. We will adjust that momentarily. But first, let's choose the fuel. So I'm going to go up here and choose the fuel level %. I don't want to, this also needs to be a transparent gauge. So no ring color, no background color, and no ring style, and no shadow. Because this is a fuel gauge, it's going to go from 0 to 100%. So that's what I want there. I am going to draw some numbers. I'm going to draw them as is. We'll fix that momentarily. The zones, the maximum value for any zone will be 100 because the dial goes from 0 to 100. And then in our major ticks, this is going to go, oops, sorry, actually unselected it. Fuel level 1. This is going to go to 100 as well. And I don't need medium ticks. I keep doing that. Where are we here? So we have 0 to 100. Oh, and our frequency here should be every, say, 25. Because then we'll have 0, 25, 50, 75, 100. So now let's move this a little bit to get it where I want it, which is probably about here. And make these font sizes a bit smaller. Perhaps that. And then also we will shrink this down a bit because I don't need it using up everything. So how does that look for the moment? Yeah, so this is not bad as a fuel gauge down here. Perhaps a little big, so we can shrink it a bit more. Yeah, so now I have an RPM gauge with a fuel gauge at the bottom, and also a maximum RPM telltale within the same gauge. So you can use all these things to create different gauges, and you can even have, if you want to import a picture and have that as your gauge background, you can do that and just set up your needle on top of it using transparent backgrounds and everything. So I hope this has been a useful video showing how you can use the new gauge tool in the Z1 Designer to create all sorts of different gauges for use in the Z1 dashboard. We'd love to see your designs. Please post them in the gallery in the Z1 Designer, or you can screenshot them and put them in our Discord channel. We'll have the link for that in the description below. And if you don't already have the Designer, you can get it at www.z1dashboard.com.